First and foremost, I just want to thank the chairman and Speaker Hasty for conducting and organizing this hearing, and my members for joining us today. And I want to thank the administration and the chancellor for taking the time to join us today and submitting your testimony. Do you recall, Chancellor, before the administration rolled out this proposal, you were in Albany? I mean, you made several trips, but right before that, you were up in Albany a couple of times. You were even in my district in Flushing about 2 weeks before the rollout. Do you recall those visits?
I take your word for it, sir. Yes. I made a lot of visits when I first arrived in New York.
And you probably may not recall also, but during those visits, we did address the issue of the SHSATs. We asked you directly, is this something that the administration and your team is working on? And if so, we have ideas, we have legislation, we have proposals that we want to work on. And you told us that this is not on the radar. This is not something that you're working on. And then 2 weeks later, I think none of us got notice of the proposal. And over one weekend, this process was rolled out while excluding an entire community that cares very deeply about this issue. After that, I think the mayor was contrite about the process, and I appreciate him coming forward and saying the process was flawed, but there is a problem here. And I, for one, when I was I remember visiting the Aspen Institute a couple years ago, education panel, and I remember hearing about this survey of educational policymakers and elected officials about how they viewed education. As a parent versus a policymaker. And when the results came back, there was a wide discrepancy how we care about education as a parent versus as policymakers. And I think your intention, all of our intentions here is for the collective betterment of our New York City schools. But I know that there are differences of how we should move forward. And I guess my ultimate question is, do you think that racially balancing a few high schools through this process will resolve the problem of racial inequality and segregation that's deeply rooted in our public schools?
So, Assemblymember Kim, thank you again for the question. Let's be clear. There are a small number of schools in New York City that are governed by a state law that does not allow us to address that issue. And those are the specialized high schools. So the reason we're even having this hearing is because there's a state law that governs how we can even address that broader issue that you've mentioned. At the same time, as I've mentioned in my testimony, we believe that the academic achievement of all students, all 1.1 million students in the New York City Department of Education, of whom 70% are Black and Latino, 70%. So when we're talking about the New York City Department of Education and issues of segregation, issues of integration, issues of academic achievement, it is incumbent upon us to look at all systems and structures, especially systems and structures that, based on the evidence, which we have considerable evidence, do not serve all of our students. So I think this is but one of many issues that we should be looking at and that we are looking at and addressing. I am very proud of our community education districts and the work that they are doing to address this issue. Again, this notion that a localized approach is a good approach is something that we embrace, but at the same time, while we have great work happening at our local community education council districts, it's also important that as an administration, we are shining a light on systemic issues. And this particular issue is one issue that the community education councils can't tackle because there's a state law. So I do think, to your question and to the sentiment of the question, there is a bigger conversation that needs to be had about academic outcomes for all students. But this particular issue is germane because there's a state law that really prevents us from making changes.
Yes, and Mr. Chairman, if I may just finish by, I represent a predominantly Asian American community in my district, and throughout this process, some of the narrative that was put forth of accusing some of the Asian communities of coming from a privileged place was very hurtful to many immigrants, especially because the majority of the students that go to these specialized schools come from low-income communities, and they're mostly recent immigrants. So we do not come from a place of privilege. So that process itself has been very painful to hear as a community. And to my concluding question is, you brought up the 3 schools that are under state law, but there's how many specialized high schools? There's 9, right? Or there's 9 total, right? And only 3 of the 9 schools are guided by the state law, right? So can the city and the mayor and the administration unilaterally change the standards for the remainder of the schools without state law being changed?
So the 3 schools that existed in 1971 are the 3 schools covered by the law. Mayor Bloomberg added 5 additional specialized schools, yet the disparity and the disproportionality of admissions remains the same for all 8. So it is our position that you cannot just address 3 without taking on all 8. In addition, it's important to understand that the 3 specialized schools covered in 1971's law constitute 80% of the students in the specialized schools. So even if there was something done differently, which is not our position, for the 5, you're still not addressing the vast majority of those students. In terms of the conversation that's happened in the community, I think that Mayor de Blasio, and I've been on record as well, as saying, the process should have been, could have been, much better, much more inclusive. I just want to remind us that in 1971, the process was much less inclusive than what we're having now when HEC Calandra was implemented. And I want to also, Assemblymember Kim, thank you for the opportunity to clarify something that's very important here. I have been very clear that as Chancellor, my responsibility is to all 1.1 million students in the system. But let me tell you what the narrative has been against me by the mere fact that I have brought up this discrepancy in admissions to the specialized schools. What has been said about me as a chancellor, as the grandson of immigrants as well, as an English language learner, that the only reason that I'm taking this on is because I am a Latino, and that my intent is to somehow benefit Latino students at the expense of everyone else. How disrespectful is that, to impugn my integrity as the only reason to take it on because I'm a Latino? So when I've made those comments about the fact that I am not taking this on because I feel Latino students earned or have these seats as a matter of fact, it's been twisted in some communities as an attack on the Asian American community. A community who in San Francisco, in Houston, in Las Vegas, everywhere I have served, I have fought and fought alongside them for educational rights. So I want to be very clear, and I want to thank you for the opportunity to clarify that I serve and represent all students in New York City. And I want to be really clear that there are much more enlightened ways that is supported by research, that is supported by educational experts, identifying students for opportunities in public schools. That is about, sir.
Mr. Kim, thank you. Ms. Seawright.